Demonstrations across America. Thousands protest on the streets, angry at the election results.
Donald Trump, go away!
There's been unrest from the East Coast to the West Coast as parts of the country rebel against the man who will be their president.
It's been a horrible day. It was a horrible night. It's just been a horrible past few months, and we want Trump out.
We'll next see Donald Trump as he heads here to the White House later today to meet President Obama. I'm live in Washington with the very latest.
Also this lunchtime, the first victim of the Croydon tram crash is named. The driver is released on bail. And Prince Harry visits Westminster Abbey's Garden of Remembrance, his first appearance since warning the press about privacy.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Mary Nightingale in Washington and Alistair Stewart in the studio.
Good afternoon from Washington. Shock turned to anger across parts of the United States last night as opponents of Donald Trump took to the streets in noisy protest. Thousands of people snaked through Manhattan towards Trump Tower, with crowds shouting and accusing Mr. Trump of racism. On the West Coast in California, windows were smashed and fires started as the backlash began against the man who will become this country's president. He is set to meet the current president this afternoon. We'll have more on that in just a moment. But first, our correspondent Robert Moore on the public outcry.
These were protests in cities across America. Not large, but passionate and disruptive.
Not my president! Not my president!
A sign that there are many Americans who will not easily accept the reality of a Donald Trump presidency.
We reject the president-elect!
In Manhattan, they converged on the Fifth Avenue skyscraper, where the president-elect lives and works. The defiance and the outrage of demonstrators bolstered by the fact that Hillary Clinton secured more votes than Trump in this election, even though she lost under the Electoral College system. And in Washington, too, there was a march. Many in minority communities telling me they fear that hate and intolerance will be unleashed across America.
This is a protest against him, and we stand for democracy.
Can you ever accept him as your president?
Absolutely not. That's why I'm here.
These nationwide protests may be just beginning. The anger on the political left here is immense and could easily build towards inauguration. That is still 70 days away, meaning the transition could be punctuated by anger and disturbances on the streets of this politically fractured nation. We haven't seen Donald Trump since the early hours of yesterday morning, when he promised to bind America's wounds. But from a candidate who promises to deport millions of undocumented workers, prosecute his former opponent, and potentially ban Muslims from entering the US, it can be no surprise there are many who are skeptical that this will be a magnanimous presidency. Later today, he will be here in Washington to meet with President Obama. The transfer of power will then be underway. A supremely uncomfortable moment, given that Trump has promised to dismantle Obama's reforms. And of course, with Trump's questioning of the president's birthplace, there is a very personal backstory to their awkward relationship.
And if he wasn't born in this country, which is a real possibility, I'm not saying it happened, I'm saying it's a real possibility, much greater than I thought 2 or 3 weeks ago, then he has pulled one of the great cons in the history of politics.
Even as some protested last night, millions of others are exhilarated at the idea of a maverick taking power. So Trump has his army of supporters as well. Robert Moore, ITV News, Washington.
President Obama joked yesterday that he and Donald Trump have some pretty significant differences, and he was not exaggerating. The pair have made their dislike of each other intensely clear.
I think he's the worst president maybe in the history of our country. I think he's been a disaster. He's been weak.
This guy is temperamentally unfit to be commander-in-chief, and he is
not equipped to be president.
They've created ISIS. Hillary Clinton created ISIS with Obama. Created with Obama.
If somebody can't handle a Twitter account, they can't handle the nuclear codes.
The war of words there between the current president and the man he'll be handing over to. Well, let's get some thoughts from our Washington correspondent, Robert Moore. Now, Robert, their relationship has been pretty fractious, hasn't it, to say the least? So it's presumably not going to be an easy meeting between the pair later today.
Well, look, Mary, to call this an awkward meeting, I think would be kind of understatement of the decade. I can think of no more uncomfortable encounter between a president and a successor. It's not just this kind of birther lie that Donald Trump has propagated for so long, this idea that he suggested that President Obama was not born in Hawaii and therefore was never a legitimate US president, should never even have been in the White House. You know, that's almost comical in one sense, but for many African Americans, it's, you know, deeply offensive. It is a racist conspiracy theory and nothing more than that. But beyond that, what does President Obama regard as his two great domestic and foreign policy achievements? Well, at home, of course, it's healthcare reform, and in terms of foreign policy, it's the Iran deal. And Donald Trump is promising on day one to try and unravel, dismantle both of those. And just understand that for the president's administration, this was a titanic political struggle to get those passed. So it really will be most awkward, I think. Look, we're going to see smiles and no doubt warm words in the Oval Office in a few hours' time. But beyond that, there will be, I'm sure, real personal hostility.
Robert Moore, thank you very much indeed. And Donald Trump's victory then continues to reverberate right around the world. Back in London, the Chancellor delivered a coded warning to the President-elect not to block international trade. Our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Shipp, is live for us. So Chris, tell us about developments in Westminster this morning then.
Well, Mary, Theresa May is still waiting for her phone call with the President-elect. Downing Street tell me that will happen at the earliest opportunity. But I have to say he's already spoken to several other world leaders, Turkey, Egypt, Canada, Mexico, South Korea, Japan among them. The only European leader that Mr Trump has spoken to thus far is the Irish Premier Enda Kenny. That might be as much to do with the fact that he's got a golf course there he wants to expand rather than anything else. But I think for Theresa May here, clearly the key point she needs to discuss is Brexit and free trade deals. Remember, it was President Obama who said that the UK would be at the back of the queue if we were to leave the European Union. Mr Trump later said would be at the front of the queue. But we also know that Mr Trump is not a huge fan of free trade. He's promised to slap punitive tariffs on Chinese and Mexican imports. Now, as it happens, the Chinese Premier was in London, the Vice Premier, sorry, was in London today with the Chancellor Philip Hammond. He was having a tour of the London Stock Exchange, and after that visit, the Chancellor Philip Hammond gave this warning to Mr Trump about how much Britain values free trade.
Well, Britain's always believed that the best way long-term to protect jobs and promote prosperity is free markets and free trade. But look, President Trump has just been elected by the American people. He will want to consult with his advisors, talk to officials, and I'm sure we will have a very constructive dialogue, as we do with the Chinese, with the new American administration.
Of course, it's not only Britain that wants answers. The President of the European Commission today said, well, what about climate change? What about your commitment to NATO? What about the EU-US trade deal? So lots and lots of questions, Mary, not so many answers, of course, so far.
Chris Shipp, thank you very much. And some others have been expressing shock at yesterday's result in different ways. Walls of the New York subway have become a blanket of post-it notes with messages from those angry at Donald Trump's victory. But among those messages, there's also a sense of unity here and hope that the country can pull together. Helena Carter explains.
New York's underground, an unlikely place for overcoming what for many Democrats was no less than devastation. Questions being asked, and while the answers for millions aren't forthcoming, the messages of love and positivity are. Sentiments that rang loud and clear in Hillary Clinton's concession speech yesterday as she spoke of the future for young Americans, of hope and of dreams.
Never doubt that you are valuable and powerful and deserving of every chance and opportunity in the world.
Across the world, celebrity messages of support and of coming together at what for many in America is the most divisive of times. Some of the world's biggest stars who were vehemently against Trump, not letting their sense of humour slip.
Are you still going to punch Donald Trump in the face? Because you can now get arrested for that, I think, yeah.
I can't do that now.
Yeah, right.
The flicker of flames is illuminating peaceful protests across the United States. Silent contemplation, a stark contrast to America's most famous presenter, Ellen DeGeneres, who voiced what many across the world right now are thinking.
I believe that we can all come together because if you take away the labels, you realize that we're far more alike than we are different. We have so much in common, our differences actually make us stronger. We need to have the kindness and respect for one another.
A kindness shown on national television and tucked away in the subway. The election may have left a bitter aftertaste for many, but these words providing sweet support for the woman who would have been America's first female president. A woman whose supporters remain loyal and full of love. Helena Carter, ITV News.
Well, joining me now is Dr. Catherine Tinsley, who's director of Georgetown Women's Leadership Institute. Now, first of all, these protests across the country, are you surprised by what you've seen?
I'm actually heartbroken about what I've seen. You know, we are a country that's divided, and we have to find a path forward. Fortunately, one of the things that I've been studying for the past 25 years is conflict resolution. And so I think what we need is some basic conflict resolution skills right now. And primarily that means stopping all the talk about the other party being crazy, about the other side, you know, being somehow non-American, and start trying to really understand their point of view.
Okay, let me ask you this. Why did Hillary lose the women's vote? Because she didn't capture women, did she, evidently?
Yeah, so she captured just over half of all the women overall, but what she lost really was the white women's vote. And she lost...
But why?
So I think it's because people are putting too much on gender. So women don't primarily identify with gender. That's not their primary social category. And so what happens is we've put all this stuff on gender, we exaggerate gender differences, and really there's so much more going on. Women that did not vote for Hillary Clinton were identifying with a different social category. They were identifying with race, with class, with socioeconomic status, and with the real problems that are happening in their communities.
Okay. That was then. This is now. You now have a Trump leadership coming up. How's that going to be with gender? How's that going to be with abortion? How's that going to be with women's rights?
Yes. So I do think that and hope that we've got a more pragmatic person as a leader than we did as a candidate. And so one of the things that we do know is that populism gets people elected, but you know, it's a rhetoric that you can't actually execute on without working together. Unfortunately, we do have a system of checks and balances in place.
So are you concerned that women might lose the right to abortion, for example? He's been very strong on that.
Yeah, so that's I think one of the biggest dangers that we face. And I think that we have to galvanize as a country. Those that are pro-choice need to be able to make sure that they have representation and that their voice is heard. That is something that is a danger. That is a danger. I can't deny that is a danger.
But he has said that he'll give maternity rights to women for 6 weeks if they don't get them through their own companies. So there are positives, surely.
So there are some positives, but we do have to be a little bit careful about that 6 weeks maternity leave, because that is for birth, after you give birth, and that's not taking into account that, you know, we need paid parental leave, and that it's more than just mothers that give birth that need time off.
This is a big issue. There's so much more still to come. For the moment, thank you very much indeed for your time, Dr. Tinsley.
Pleasure.
And that's it from me this lunchtime. Back to you, Alistair, in the studio.
Mary, thank you. The first of the 7 victims of the Croydon tram crash has been named. Dane Chinnery was 19 years old. The driver of the tram, which derailed yesterday, has been released on bail. British Transport Police are still at the scene where the tram flipped on its side yesterday morning. We'll be there live in a moment. First, Nick Wallace reports.
Killed on his commute to work, Dane Chinnery from New Addington in South London was 19 years old. Friends described him as a lad full of smiles, happy and outgoing, and always willing to help other people out. Tom Dale was in the crash which killed Dane and was himself injured as it overturned.
I just come round after blacking out, and I just called up my dad crying, saying, "Dad, I need your help. Come get me," sort of thing. I've been involved in an accident. When I woke up, I was like, "Where's Dane? I can't find him. I don't know where he is." And all that was there on where he was sitting was his boot. And it turned out that he was actually under the tram. It was just genuine lad. He was there for everyone, really. Tried to be there and help people out as much as he could, and he didn't deserve it because he was still quite young, and obviously he was just trying to have a normal day at work.
The site of the tram's derailment near the Sandilands stop just east of Croydon in South London is still being investigated and remains a possible crime scene. The 42-year-old driver from Beckenham in Bromley has been arrested and released on bail. More than 50 people were injured in the crash. The last was discharged from Croydon University Hospital this morning, but 3 seriously injured people remain at St George's in Tooting. Surgeons have operated on them, but there's no update as to their condition. Although some trams were running this morning, the section around the Sandilands area is expected to remain closed at least until the weekend. Flowers wrapped in ribbons bearing the colours of the football club Dane supported, Crystal Palace, have already been laid near the scene. As friends and family come to terms with losing Dane, they and the families of the 6 other people who died will be wanting to know how this terrible crash was caused and who or what was responsible. Nick Wallace, ITV News.
And Paul Davis joins us live from the scene in South London this lunchtime. Paul, as Nick just said, are there any more clues as to what caused this dreadful accident?
Well, Alistair, the speed the tram was travelling still seems to be the main focus of this investigation. We've now spoken to several survivors who were on the tram, and all of them have said that it took that corner faster than usual, faster than they thought was safe. Now, British Transport Police have just given us their latest briefing. They say speed's one factor they're looking at, but they'll be looking at others before they reach any conclusion. And as we've just heard, the man who can help them most, the driver, has been questioned at length, but has now been released on bail. The next stage is for the carriages to be lifted so they can be examined closely. I believe that's likely to take place tomorrow.
Paul, thank you. A man convicted of attempted murder has been caught after spending 3 days on the run from Pentonville Prison. Matthew Baker was found by police at a house in Ilford last night. Police are still hunting for another man who escaped with him, James Whitlock. NHS England has lost a High Court appeal over a drug described as a game changer in the fight against HIV and AIDS. In August, judges ruled that the preventative treatment known as PrEP should be made available on the NHS, but NHS England had argued that they should only treat those people already infected and had wanted local authorities to take responsibility. Well, joining me now is Deborah Gold from the National AIDS Trust. So it seems that NHS England aren't going to appeal, but they voiced strongly this morning concerns about responsibility and cost. You're halfway there. You haven't won completely.
Absolutely. It's a great step towards finally seeing PrEP available for people who need it, but we're still waiting for the decision from NHS England now that they have a chance to look at the evidence about cost effectiveness and about how much PrEP works and how many people it will help to decide whether they're going to commission it.
But it's also a fundamental point of principle, isn't it, as to whether the NHS exists to cure people when they fall ill or issue drugs, treatments, whatever it may be, to stop them becoming ill. That's at the heart of this debate.
It is at the heart of the debate, but actually, if you look across NHS England, they do all kinds of things that help with prevention. So they do things for diabetes prevention, they do healthy towns. So this is a fairly common sense judgment from the court. So local authorities still have a really important role in prescribing PrEP and bridging that gap to make the drug available. But essentially what the court said was, of course, if NHS has to pay to treat people that have HIV and there's a treatment available that can prevent people getting HIV, thus reducing the number of people they have to treat, of course it makes sense that they should be able to pay for that if they decide they want to.
From the early days of the campaign, and I'm old enough to remember Norman Fowler and icebergs and what have you, at the heart of the campaign has been safe sex and safe lifestyles. Haemophiliacs is a totally different argument. Does this preventative rather than curative treatment not send a dangerous signal about safe sex?
It doesn't, because people who take PrEP are being responsible by taking action to prevent themselves from acquiring HIV. It's one way of doing that. There's a range of ways of doing that. But we know at a larger public health level that we aren't solving HIV. 17 people a day acquire HIV. It's a growing problem in the UK, and it's a basic public health message to prevent is always better than curing.
Deborah Gold, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much. And finally this lunchtime, Prince Harry was back in the public eye this lunchtime, just days after warning the media about coverage of his private life. The Prince was at Westminster Abbey paying his respects in the Field of Remembrance. Warren Nettleford has more.
They paused to remember. These two princes have both served in the military. This morning they joined hundreds of other veterans ahead of Remembrance Day at Westminster Abbey. Lined up, small crosses adorned with poppies, each of them in memory of a life lost.
To see that so many people remember the war and the sacrifices that were made for it, and even the youngsters are turning out on occasions like this.
It's the one time when we can come together as veterans, most of whom we will find we know each other from years of service in the army or the other forces, but for us, particularly around the military side, and we can come together and remember our comrades who have both served and those particularly who have either been injured or fallen.
Prince Harry had time for the well-wishers and cameras today. He was keen to return the focus to his duties as Prince, rather than his relationship with the actress Meghan Markle, which caused him to speak out earlier this week. In the spotlight once again, but this time for a cause that means so much to so many. Warren Nettleford, ITV News.
And that is it this lunchtime. The ITV Evening News is back at 6:30, but from all of us here in London and in Washington, D.C., a very good afternoon to you. Bye-bye.